A presidential campaign like no other.
No administration has accomplished more.
In a political season like no other.
Donald Trump failed us.
Donald Trump versus Joe Biden.
Put America first.
This is a battle for the soul of the United States of America.
A choice as fundamental as any in American history, under the most trying circumstances since World War II.
We're going to build our economy, our country, better than it was before this god-awful crisis.
100 days from now, voters will decide between two very different futures.
There's never been a comeback like we're making right now.
And the whole world is watching.
From NBC News, this is Decision 2020, 100 days to go. Here is Chuck Todd.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. After a presidential campaign that has already seemed to last an eternity, we are now just 100 days away from what could be the most consequential election of our lifetimes. Yes, it's a phrase that's said a lot, but this time we may mean it. On November 3rd, after 4 years of Donald Trump, Americans will decide what kind of president we want, what kind of country we want, and we will do it at a precarious moment in our history, a time of political division, racial strife, economic calamity, and of course, a deadly pandemic that has now killed about 150,000 Americans, and right now with no end in sight. We've confronted all of these things before as a country, but we've never tried to do it all at once. Needless to say, there is a lot at stake. Over the next hour, we're going to take a close look at the state of the race right now, the epic showdown between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Joining me, NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker, veteran CNBC political reporter Kayla Tausche, and Telemundo senior correspondent Christina Landano. All of us looking at a presidential campaign and a political moment like no other.
My administration has taken the most aggressive action in modern history to prevent the spread of this illness in the United States. We are ready.
Despite deflection,
I don't take responsibility at all.
Responsibility shifting.
The governors are responsible. They have to take charge.
And denial.
We are the king of testing already.
It's clear with 100 days to go, the 2020 election will be a referendum on President Trump and his handling of the virus.
What would you have done differently facing this crisis?
Well, nothing.
But the virus continues to drag down Mr. Trump's political standing. 37% of voters approve of how he's handled it, down 8 points since March. The top three indicators for an incumbent, his job rating, personal feelings about him, and attitudes on his reelection, all are underwater. Mr. Trump is counting on a quick economic recovery.
The good thing is the numbers will be coming out just prior to the election, so people will be able to see those numbers.
But voters are tuning in now. 77% already say they are highly interested in this election, and most of them have already made up their minds. President Trump trails Joe Biden by 11 points, with just 13% of voters up for grabs, saying they might change their mind about either candidate.
Donald Trump's failure to fight the coronavirus with the same energy and focus that he uses to troll his enemies on Twitter has cost us lives.
The president is doing his best to make the election about anything else, trying to drive up Joe Biden's negatives.
Biden is a very willing Trojan horse for socialism. Biden is a puppet of Bernie Sanders, AOC, the militant left. Nobody will be safe in a Biden America.
If it ends up being a popularity contest or worse, a referendum on President Trump, I think he's got some real headwinds to face.
Many Republicans question whether the president can avoid the spotlight long enough to make the election a choice rather than simply a verdict on him.
I think right now, obviously Trump has a problem with the middle of the electorate, with independents, and they're the people who are going to decide in national elections.
The election will also be a referendum on the voting system itself. In just 40 days, the first ballots will be mailed out in North Carolina. 22 more states begin mailing absentee ballots 45 days or more before the election, launching a fight over access to the ballot.
Voting by mail is wrought with fraud and abuse.
In fact, fraud via mail-in ballots is quite rare, in setting up what may be a weeks-long process to count absentee votes.
We're putting together a major initiative of lawyers to go out and make sure that we're in every single district in the country to patrol this.
More than 3 weeks after the New York primaries, thousands of absentee ballots still had not been counted, leaving some closely watched races unresolved. A big red flag for November. Well, all the polls right now seem to paint the same picture. advantage Biden, but of course things can change, and memories of Donald Trump's 2016 upset win over Hillary Clinton certainly have Democrats apprehensive and Republicans hopeful that things will change. Our expert in such things is, of course, national political correspondent Steve Kornacki. So, Steve, it's interesting, but what is the main difference this time as opposed to 2016? And is it simply that little I that's next to Donald Trump's name on the ballot?
You know, it might just be, it might just be as simple as that, Chuck. I mean, the two differences you can see right here on this screen, our latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll. Number one, Joe Biden, Trump's opponent, he's over 50%. You know, Hillary Clinton led in the polling in 2016, but how many times did you see her over that 50% mark against Donald Trump? Remember, there were some third-party candidates in 2016 gobbling up a pretty big chunk of the vote back then. You're not really seeing that right now, and Biden's over 50%. And also, the margin here, both in our poll, an 11-point lead for Joe Biden, and really all of the other major national polls that are out there right now showing sizable Biden leads. You know, in 2016, we say Hillary Clinton led pretty much the whole race. Her leads were basically about 3 to 8 points. It was usually somewhere in that range. We're sitting in high single digits, low double digits right now in poll after poll. So there are some differences there. There's also, if you take it from the national level to the battleground state level, here's 6 key battleground states. Donald Trump in 2016 went 6 for 6 in these states. He won every single one of them, including a couple here, 3 states that hadn't gone Republican in 30 years. He won Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Take a look right now at the polling we're seeing in those states right now. In all 6 of those states right now, you see Joe Biden leading Donald Trump in the polling. Biden doesn't have to go 6 for 6 here when you look at the Electoral College map. He probably needs 2 or 3 to get over 270. There's also this, if you just compare Trump to past presidents running for re-election, where did they stand in our NBC News poll at this point? There's basically 3 different groups here. Reagan and Clinton, they were way ahead. They both won easily. Obama, George W. Bush, they led pretty narrowly. They won pretty narrowly. 1980, 92. Carter and H.W. Bush, they trailed big and they lost pretty decisively. Where does Trump fit in? In our poll, not quite as bad as those two, but a lot worse than all the others, Chuck.
You know, Steve, it was interesting that you did all those states. There's 2 states that we're all talking about a lot more today than we were even a year ago. That's not even on that list. Georgia and Texas. So it just shows you that that's another aspect of this race right now. This map seems to be expanding. Hey, Steve, stick around. We're going to be checking back in with you later in the hour on some Senate race looks there. But let's go to the panel right now. As I said, I got White House correspondent Kristen Welker, CNBC's Kayla Tausche, the Washington correspondent for our friends at CNBC, and Telemundo senior Washington correspondent Christina Landano. Kristen, let me just start with you and the mood of the White House. They're well aware of his standing, but at times it seems as if the president himself isn't. Is this a White House that is realizing how far behind they are?
My sense is they are starting to, Chuck. There's deep concern within the White House, within the Trump campaign, that the president needs to do something differently. You saw him try to turn the page on the coronavirus crisis, try to put the focus on the economy and the states that are reopening. And if you talk to his aides and allies, they will say that essentially they weren't getting the message across that he was leading on this crisis. And if you look at the polling, time and time again, it essentially that said that the American public didn't believe as though he was out front on this. So you saw a major change in strategy this past week. President Trump bringing back those daily briefings instead of being at the podium, though, with his task force. He was at the podium alone. This is a risky strategy, Chuck. These briefings are a lot shorter than when they got rid of them back in April. But the question is, will he stay on message? Remember, they were canceled in April because he made a slew of controversial comments. There's no doubt, though, administration officials feel as though the president needs to change course. He more forcefully endorsed masks, for example, this past week. Will that continue? Will he stay on message? And will it resonate with voters? One administration official said to me, look, there is time to come back, but there's not a lot of time, Chuck. We are reaching the end of summer, and so there is real pressure on this president to show that he can lead with these 3 crises that you laid out, Chuck.
It's a great Yogi Berra-ism. It's getting late early. And in this campaign, I think it is. You know, you pointed something out there, Kristen, about the original coronavirus briefings led by the president. That was one of, you put the president's approval ratings on a chart here and you watched it go down. That was one pivot point. Cristina Ladano, probably the second pivot point that took Trump from being a deficit of 5 points to Biden to now this deficit of 10, was that infamous night, St. John's Church, Lafayette Park. You were there. You experienced this in ways that none of us care to have done ourselves. That seems to be also an important moment in this campaign.
That's right, Chuck, because none of us, very few of us, thought we would ever see something like that in this country. I had lived through it in Latin America, but not here in the U.S. We were getting ready to go live for our evening newscast, and all of a sudden we realized we were under attack. We did not expect it. There were people kneeling in protest around me when we started tasting the tear gas, and then came the mounted police and the flash grenades. I actually looked down to see if my feet were still there. And then we realized we were actually being targeted. They started shooting at us. My bureau chief got hit in the back, the photographer in his stomach, and also in his arm, and I got hit in my arm. We don't know what it was. Pepper balls, some people have said, rubber bullets. You have some pictures of what my arm was looking like. And everything got worse when we realized that all this had happened because President Trump wanted to walk across Lafayette Park and take a picture with a Bible in his hand. This infuriated church leaders, members of the military. Republicans would actually run away from the press when they were asked to react to what had happened. And the president the next day was actually celebrating, tweeting, overwhelming force, domination. These are words and images that his critics say are autocratic, dictatorial, and have no place in this country, Chuck.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, you know, we framed this election as a referendum on the virus and the president's leadership on that. You look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, his approval rating on the virus is not great. It's at 39%. His approval rating on race relations is even worse. And I think that moment in particular is seared. And the question is whether the president can at all erase that moment. Let's turn a little bit to what the president is hoping for, Kayla. You heard it in our piece that we put together. He expects this third quarter boom in the economy that is going to remind everybody of what the economy was like in February. How realistic is that?
Well, it depends on how much money, Chuck, the government is willing to inject into the economy. Just this week, we learned some 32 million Americans are receiving unemployment benefits. That compares to about 2 million a year ago. So the underlying economy is reeling, even as the stock market continues to notch new records. We do know that voters, even as they began to prefer Joe Biden on the coronavirus response and social justice issues, they stuck with Trump on the economy until very recently. And advisors believe that that is the area where they can stem the tide. They want to return to an argument that President Trump made the economy the best it's ever been before this external shock to the system, and he can do it again. But to do that, he needs to extinguish the virus. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen this change in tone that Kristen highlighted earlier, where they know now that they need to get the virus under control so that businesses can stay open. People feel comfortable going out, spending money, going to restaurants and businesses. Without that confidence, the president's promises cannot actually bear out the result that he wants. Worth noting, Chuck, by the end of this year, the administration is on pace to spend in stimulus programs more than 10 times what the government spent to bail out American banks in 2008. So that is just the scope of these programs that the Trump administration is trying to enact to shore up the economy and reverse financial fortunes in a narrowing window of time.
Kayla, I'm curious, is it because of all this government money that's being infused into the economy, not just in this country, but all over the world, is that why the stock market looks so different from the economy the rest of us in America are staring at?
That's right, Chuck. I mean, the stock market is not the economy. The stock market right now here in the U.S. is being led by a handful of very large corporations, many of whom are seeing the Federal Reserve actually going in and buying their debt and investing in these companies like Apple, Amazon, Home Depot, Disney. They are propelling the market to new highs. even as the underlying economy, real Americans are unemployed. We have unemployment in this country that is higher than the peak of the Great Recession. So there is a joint effort here to keep the market afloat so that the president has that as a talking point to continue pointing to, but also to try to shore up the balance sheet of the American family.
I tell you, Kayla, that was terrific. That we don't nationalize our industries here, but it is interesting that we're investing government money in our major industries here. But it does that is the picture we are staring at. Thanks to all of you for getting us off to a great start here. We got a lot more to go in this program that I think will give you everything you need to know with 100 days to go. So you want to stay with us, because when we come back, we're going to hear from two veteran political operatives who are among the best in the business to get their take on 2020. Both of them have gotten to the political World Series, if you will. We're going to also look at the second most important decision voters will be making this fall: who will control the Senate? Plus, a look at how social media giants are or not policing the accuracy of online ads this season. And finally, handicapping the potentially decisive Latino vote. All when we continue with Decision 2020, 100 days to go. Welcome back. As the campaign endgame begins to play out over the next 100 days, we will see an all-out political war unfold between the Trump and Biden camps and their surrogates. So, who better to turn to than a couple of veterans of such wars to give us an idea of what to expect? For this, I turn it over to my pal, Kristen Welker. So, Kristen, who you got for us?
Well, we have a great conversation coming up, Chuck. I want to introduce two very experienced old hands when it comes to American politics. We have Democratic strategist David Plouffe, who's, of course, the campaign manager to Barack Obama, then senior advisor to President Obama, so he's no stranger to all of this, and senior strategist to Mitt Romney's campaign, Stuart Stevens, now, of course, a member of the Republican anti-Trump Lincoln Project and author of It Was All a Lie: How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump, out next week, so you don't want to miss that. Thank you both so much for being here for a really important conversation. And David, I want to start with you. Obviously, both men have had to get really creative when it comes to trying to reach out to voters against the backdrop of this pandemic. So we've seen Joe Biden holding virtual town halls. He just did this joint conversation with former President Barack Obama. How do you assess his strategy so far? He's obviously leading in the polls, and Democrats want to ask the question, how does he keep it going? Does he need to have more visibility, or should he stay the course?
Well, Kristen, I think that he's starting to more aggressively fill in the blanks for what he would do as president. I think that more than enough people to defeat Donald Trump, in my view, have decided they don't want to rehire him. So Biden's job now is to make sure you keep some pressure there, but I think events largely will do that. That he's got, good plans that will make a difference in our lives. So, you posted an infographic earlier that showed that, yes, the election is 100 days out from today, but voting starts in 45 days. In key battleground states, in about 65 to 70 days, a lot of people are going to be voting. So you're running out of time. So Joe Biden has to continue on the economy, on healthcare, on the pandemic. I think a big question for voters will be, when we do have a vaccine, who can you trust to make sure it's distributed and executed effectively? And then you've got to worry, and this is more about the campaign probably than Joe Biden, the complication of voting. You've got a lot of people we still have to register in the Democratic Party. You've got a lot of people who vote by mail for the first time. We saw in June in some primaries, 7 to 8% of votes did not count because people didn't fill them in properly. So there's just basic education that has to happen. So I think, yes, for swing voters, Joe Biden's doing right now about as well as he can do. I mean, he's now leading with seniors. He's winning in the suburbs, all places that Democrats historically have struggled in recent presidential elections, particularly with seniors. So hold on to as much of that as you can. But then the execution of the actual voting that needs to take place is a huge degree of difficulty.
Yeah, and Stuart Stevens, let me bring you in on that point. Look, we've seen President Trump this past week really shift his strategy in acknowledgement of the fact that it is getting late early, as we've been talking about, right? That he really needs to change it up here and get out front, as his aides are saying. So he's doing that, essentially using the White House as a political rally, if you will, although trying to stay on message. Do you think that that's going to be effective? We also see him again stoking the cultural wars like he did in 2016. Is that playbook going to work given the amount of time he has left?
My bet is not. The question is, what is this election about? And Donald Trump had planned 2 elections, one to run on the economy and one to run against socialism. So the economy is the worst that it's been since the Depression. So that doesn't look great. Joe Biden and socialism doesn't really go together. I mean, the whole idea that Trump's famous nicknames called Sleepy Joe Biden, I mean, Sleepy's not exactly a nickname that scares women and children. So they're confused about this. They don't know what to do. And, most markedly, there's no policy in this campaign. I mean, normally in a presidential campaign, you would be rolling out what you're going to do for re-elect, what you do if you're reelected. I don't think anybody can tell you what Donald Trump would do if he was reelected as president. And meanwhile, you have the Biden campaign in a very methodical way, laying out policy that actually affects people's lives. If you listen to the speech that the Vice President Biden gave on home care, helping those who need child care and home attendants, I mean, those are real problems people are struggling with. And meanwhile, you have Donald Trump up there who's like running for the Landmark Commission, trying to protect monuments, including Confederate monuments. And I just don't think that it has the immediacy of how is this going to make my life better.
Yeah, I think you raise an important point. Biden also rolling out his plan to bring back manufacturing jobs, which even some Trump aides have said, hey, that's something that could win over Trump voters. On the point of Sleepy Joe Biden, one aide said to me, sleepy sounds pretty good when you've had 4 years of exhaustion. That was from a Trump official. So to your point, his punches so far don't seem to be landing. Chuck, with that, let me send it back to you because I know you've got some questions as well.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm going to stay on that same topic. And Stuart, I know you were a little more involved in politics in the 80s than either David or I. Apologies for aging you a little bit. But explain to our viewers this. Why did George H.W. Bush and Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater, they're basically, they ran this sort of non-issue campaign against Dukakis, made up a 17-point deficit, and able to pull it off. Why do you think that won't work against Joe Biden the way it worked against Michael Dukakis?
Basically the question in the 88 race was, would you like a third term of Ronald Reagan? And the answer was more people would like that than not. The problem essentially that Trump has is that incumbents the races tend to be about them. So all this stuff, Donald Trump is great at promising and terrible at delivering. It's been true all his life. So now, they're confused about this. You hear it. I mean, they're running pictures of Donald Trump America and saying this is what it'll be like if Joe Biden is president, when it is what it is like when Donald Trump is president. So, listen, I saw this poll where, the Monmouth poll, where Donald Trump had a very unfavorable 48%. I've never seen anything like that. That's sort of like Eastern Bloc countries. So the hardest thing in politics is to take somebody who's very unfavorable and move them to vote for you. So his margin of error here is just going to be very, very small. And they're going to try to basically get every white vote that they can. They're going to run, and I think are running, a racially tinged campaign, unlike anything we've seen in modern politics by a president or a nominee of a party. It's very reminiscent of George Wallace. I just think he's missing the mark. I don't think he's speaking to where America is now. I mean, the same weekend that my home state of Mississippi finally voted to take down the Mississippi flag, which is basically the Confederate battle flag, you have Donald Trump who argues for the flag, saying that you should have a right to do it. So whenever a Republican is sort of on the wrong side of NASCAR and Walmart, which Donald Trump is, that's a really bad sign if you're planning to wage a cultural war.
I've always said culturally, Donald Trump hasn't moved since about 1974. He's culturally sort of thinks America is in the same place as it was in New York City in 1974. Kayla, jump in here a minute.
I want to ask a question to David about how history can be a guide here, because we have now questioned the reliability of polls as a leading indicator, but the economy has always been pretty good at telling us what could happen. The Biden campaign has seized on this, noting that no party has retained the presidency with unemployment above 8% or with net jobs lost. And I actually put this question to the Treasury Secretary in recent days, asking him how they can turn this around. And I'd like to get your response on the other side of this comment from the Treasury Secretary.
Well, there's never been a point in the history of time that we've closed down the U.S. economy. So I don't think those traditional numbers are important. What I do think is we are rebuilding the economy. The blue chip indicators for the third quarter is expecting 17% GDP. We're recreating jobs. We're providing a lot of liquidity to American business and American workers. So the president's economic plans are really working, and we still have more work to do.
David, if there is no precedent for this time, how do we figure out what the economy is going to do to the outcome of the election?
Well, listen, we faced off against Stewart and the Romney team in 2012 with unemployment very high. And so there were some lessons from that, which is the stock market had rebounded during President Obama's first term. But that was not a reason to vote for the president. OK, so small business owners, workers experienced the economy much differently. And I think, Kayla, what's really going to happen here is voters, small business owners, workers are going to make a decision that the economy generally and for them personally will never recover until we escape the clutches of this virus. And who can you trust to finally put the numbers to rest, to get a vaccine distributed, and to prepare for the next one, and to make the smart governmental policy decisions along the way? I think the jury's out on that. I think people do not think Donald Trump's capable of that. He did lead on the question of who do you trust more to lead the economy. That lead's evaporated. I think Joe Biden has an opportunity not to lead him by 10 or 15 on that measure, but maybe build a small lead. So again, this comes down to when people are casting their vote at the end of September and early October, those that wait to November, how are they feeling? Do they have confidence that Donald Trump is going to set the conditions so that their life can get better? I don't think he can. The other thing is Donald Trump kind of won the debate in 2016 with Hillary Clinton over who was going to fight for working people. Who could you trust? He became the change agent. I think Joe Biden, his biography, the kind of political figure he is, the language he uses, his policies, Stewart mentioned home health care. I think he's got an opportunity on that issue and many others to speak directly to what people care about. And Trump, what is interesting, the election is about the economy. Donald Trump's messaging on the economy is about one thing, the stock market. It's so puzzling to me. It's almost political malpractice. And so the thing that people care most about, and the virus is attached to that, obviously, he's really missing the mark on. And I know in 2012, when we won a very tough and close race, each and every day we just had to hammer that economic message. And we also developed a contrast with Mitt Romney. So Donald Trump, we are 45 days away from people voting. He has not laid out a core argument about why he should be reelected or why Joe Biden shouldn't be, other than Sleepy Joe, which I agree with Stewart is not going to scare anybody.
I tell you, I have about 6 more questions for the both of you, but instead I'll text them to you and share. We'll go those down the road. You guys were as good as I thought you'd be. Stuart Stevens, check out his new book. And if you've never read any Stuart Stevens book, both David Plouffe and I have authored books. Stuart Stevens is a writer. You're a beautiful writer, Stuart. So even if you don't agree with what he's writing, you will enjoy reading his book. Gentlemen, thank you both, and I'm sure you'll both enjoy watching sort of from where you are this time than being in the middle of this. Thank you both. No matter who wins the White House this fall, how much they'll actually be able to get done will depend in large part on which party controls the Senate. 6 years ago, under leader Mitch McConnell, Republicans won back a majority. This fall, with Joe Biden leading in the polls and with Republicans defending a whopping 23 Senate seats, with the Democrats only having to defend 12, the Democrats hope this is their chance to win back the Senate. So where do they have the best shot? For that, let's go back to Kornacki. Steve, basically there's 2 Senate battlegrounds, if you will. The close, polarized environment, and then this other world we may live in. Show us.
Exactly. So first, for some context here, let's take a look at recent presidential elections and then what the popular vote was nationally. Remember, Clinton didn't win the Electoral College. She did win the popular vote by a couple points in 2016, and that translated. Democrats gained 2 seats in 2016. If you look at recent elections, 2004, Bush won by 3. Republicans picked up 4 Senate seats there. 2012, Obama fairly narrow win, 2 seats for the Democrats there. Then you get to 2008. That's when Obama won it was a 7-point win over McCain. And remember, Democrats got a big 8-seat gain in the Senate. So the higher the popular vote margin for the winner gets, the more you have an opportunity to pick up Senate seats. And of course, right now, if you just average all the polls together that are out there, Biden's lead is 9, raises the possibility. If it could hold, we'll see. But if it did, would you be in that range? Would Democrats be in that range again? So let's take a look here at our Senate sliders. Love this screen right here. This is what we thought the battleground would basically be at the start of the year. When you say a tight, polarized election, this is what we thought. You know, Republicans said Alabama, Doug Jones running for re-election. They thought that's a clear pickup for them. They've been thinking at least. Democrats have been liking the polling in Arizona. They think Cory Gardner in Colorado, not a Trump state in 2016. They think they can get that. They think they could finally get Susan Collins in Maine. If they got those 3, lost Alabama, then maybe North Carolina, Tom Tillis, competitive state. That's the conversation. If Democrats get to 50 and Joe Biden gets elected, Democrats get the Senate. But you mentioned if you have a big Biden win nationally, it raises the possibility of a lot. Oh, that's the wrong one there. Here you go. It raises the possibility of a lot more states. Georgia, 2 races. Iowa, Kansas, Montana, maybe others. You've talked about South Carolina. The bigger that margin gets, the more come into this column.
It's fascinating. People, if this is a 1980 style election, as some people have thought it could be, Ronald Reagan bought 12 Senate seats with him in that landslide. There's not a path to 12 for the Democrats, but there is one to 8 or 9. Steve Kornacki with that. Thank you, sir. We have much more ahead on this special 100 Days edition, including a look at the outsized role social media plays in our elections and what's being done to rein it in. And then, of course, there's this, the all-important Latino vote. Could put more states in play, could decide which party controls the Senate. We're going to take a look at it in a deeper dive with 100 days to go. And we're back. We have seen it before. Media technology transforming the electoral landscape. 100 years ago, that technology was radio. In the second half of the 20th century, it was, of course, television. But here in the 21st century, with just about everyone connected to the internet, it is social media that has become a pervasive and at times often destructive force in our politics, perhaps never more so than in the run-up to this 2020 campaign. So for more on that, let's turn to CNBC's Kayla Tausche. Kayla, what do you got for us?
Well, Chuck, we all remember what happened in 2016 when social media platforms became weaponized, used by nameless, faceless individuals, organizations, even foreign countries to manipulate millions of often unsuspecting users. That kind of interference can undermine the legitimacy of an election, and the big social media companies are on notice not to let it happen again. CNBC's John Ford has taken a look at what they're doing about it.
Social media companies have new mindsets and new defenses. This time around, Facebook isn't waiting for users to report abuse. Algorithms sniff it out. The company says multiple independent studies show we've cut the engagement with fake news by more than half. The social media powerhouses are trying to avoid an ugly replay of 4 years ago when they caught heat from both sides of the aisle for leaving their users vulnerable to illegal manipulation.
We've also learned about how vulnerable social media is to corruption and misuse. The very worst examples of this are absolutely chilling and a threat to our democracy.
A report out of the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee late last year determined that Russian agents sought to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election by harming Hillary Clinton's chances of success and supporting Donald Trump. The attackers pretended to be Americans while igniting Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms with inflammatory rhetoric about divisive issues in U.S. society, like the NFL protests or gun rights. Their goal? Inspire Trump supporters to turn out to vote and get Clinton voters to stay home. It's not only Facebook that has dramatically changed its approach to combat improper influence around the election. At Twitter, a dedicated team aims to, quote, address threats posed by hostile foreign and domestic actors. And at YouTube, they've invested to, quote, reduce the spread of harmful misinformation. The companies now meet monthly with the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to discuss threats and responses. But there's still plenty of dry tinder on social media for bad actors to try to ignite once again. With coronavirus lockdowns, activism back in sports, and protesters taking to the streets, the country is once again racked by controversy leading into a major election. And, as we saw with the hack on Twitter earlier this month, even with new defenses, the social media giants might still be vulnerable.
That was CNBC's John Fort reporting, and he joins us now. John, you report that Facebook has cut its engagement with fake news by more than half, but that means there's still quite a bit of fake news left on that and other platforms. Is there evidence that Americans and users of these platforms are becoming more judicious about what they're reading and seeing?
Well, Kayla, I don't know about evidence that people are being more judicious about what they're seeing, but what the platforms are trying to do is be more of a filter and actually proactively go after users, sometimes even agents of foreign governments that are trying to corrupt the system. And even though for us, here in America, these political cycles go in 2 or 4 years, what these platforms are seeing is their battle is constant. The people who are trying to corrupt the system stay in the system, trying to inflame these tensions. And so the platforms are trying to find the behaviors of the bad actors so that they can identify them, make sure that their messages don't spread, and potentially then flare up at the time of an election when they could do so much damage.
And the bad actors are getting better at what they're trying to do, too, John. Thank you for that. Chuck, you can be sure that when these social media companies appear on Capitol Hill, that they're going to be questioned about the integrity of their systems and whether it's possible to truly safeguard them.
There's no doubt. John, I got a couple questions for you. One is this idea, I guess Facebook has talked about trying to go dark on politics within a window. That is something that international media, I think Israel is one of those countries, for instance, that prevents TV media from doing polling and things like that in the days run up. What is Facebook contemplating, and would Twitter and other social media platforms follow suit if there was this sort of political dark period before the voting?
Well, Chuck, they've got very different tacks the different platforms do. Twitter, for example, has already said, we're not going to do any political advertising whatsoever. YouTube and Facebook are still doing that. Facebook says, hey, we've got 35,000 now people in our security team going out kind of proactively trying to police this stuff. They've not said that they're going to go dark on political information. And frankly, at a time like this, where in a pandemic, there's probably going to be less face-to-face gatherings. We can see that with what's happening with the conventions. Probably a lot of these campaigns and their surrogates are going to be relying on social media and electronic media more than ever to reach voters, from the big candidates to the smaller ones. And Facebook sees that as part of their role, too. So how they thread the needle here is going to be tricky.
And one other, and I know you don't have the answer to this because none of us do, but election night, as we all know, is likely going to be election month, right? It's going to take, it took 28 days for us to get the entire vote counted in the state of Pennsylvania for their primary this year. This is the first year they've done almost exclusively mail-in ballots. The rumors, the conspiracy theories during the vote count that could sprout up on social media, are these social media companies aware of that? That 10 to 12 day period is going to be a dangerous period for misinformation. Are they prepared for it?
Chuck, I think that's the sort of thing that they are prepared for, because that's the sort of thing we can imagine, right? We can kind of draw the lines between what we know is going to happen and we expect the impacts are going to be. That's sort of the world that these tech companies and tech platforms live in. The world they don't live in is, the surprises. We saw that Twitter hack where, using social engineering, which is a fancy word for a con job, somebody was able to take over major Twitter accounts of major public figures. You can imagine something like that happening during the period when people are filling out their ballots. That would be awful. And that was something that Twitter, for example, wasn't looking for. Now they are. But it's these kinds of things. They're trying to kind of think around corners and expect the unexpected at a level that they weren't in 2016, Chuck, when, as we know, they were caught very much flat-footed.
No, it was definitely a bunch of companies that were a bit naive, perhaps, that their technology could be turned against them anyway. Our thanks to Kayla Tausche and John Fort of CNBC for that terrific segment. We'll be back in a moment with what could be the key that unlocks victory for either President Trump or Joe Biden this fall, and the fierce competition to win it. Winning elections is all about building coalitions. Whites, blacks, young, old, working class men, suburban women, and the biggest and fastest growing demographic in America, Latinos or Latinx. Telemundo's Cristina Landano has a look at how all of this can translate into political power. Cristina, what do you got?
That's right, Chuck. Well, we have some 32 million eligible Latino voters in this country. That is a little over 13% of the total. Most of them Democrats. According to the exit polls from 2016, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by a better than 2-to-1 margin. But President Trump has been able to increase his Latino voters. That means Joe Biden cannot take them for granted, especially in some states where the Latino vote could actually determine the political fate of this country. The battle is being waged en español. Biden claramente está debilitado. And both the Trump and the Biden camps are focused on three key states, Florida, Arizona, and Texas, where the Hispanic vote could decide the election.
The real question is, will they turn out? Will the Latino community turn out? Because if it chooses to turn out, not only can we decide this election, but we can decide the trajectory of where the country goes in the next 20 years.
In the past few weeks, President Trump has aggressively courted the Latino vote. In Miami, preying on the worst fears of prominent Cuban and Venezuelan leaders.
And now Joe Biden and the radical left are trying to impose the same system, socialism plus, in America.
Mr. Trump is also trying to run a campaign based on the pre-COVID economy.
That we've had the lowest unemployment numbers for Latinos, creating jobs, ensuring that wages increase.
Joe Biden, in contrast, is focusing on an economy shattered by the pandemic, one that has led to enormous suffering, with more Hispanics dying, infected, or out of a job.
Latinos want to have a president who will protect them. The coronavirus has disproportionately impacted Latino communities. The unemployment rate has gone up almost threefold under this president for Latinos.
Mr. Biden is also running on President Trump's record, reminding Hispanics of the family separations at the border, the wall, and his anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies.
You know, he's quit on you, and he's quit on this country. But this election is not just about him.
The former vice president is promising a comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants. Latino advocates point out that, remarkably, 100 days before the election, almost half of Hispanic voters have not been contacted by either campaign. Lack of interest and enthusiasm among Latinos can be especially dangerous to Democrats.
Run like Trump is winning the Latino vote. That's how you need to court the Latino vote if you're Joe Biden, because it's the turnout that is so key.
And now to talk about turnout and expectations, we are joined by Maria Teresa Kumar from Voto Latino, an organization that has endorsed Joe Biden. Maria Teresa, when we spoke last week, we talked about all these Latino voters that are eligible to vote but haven't registered yet. And this seems like an incredible challenge in the midst of a pandemic where going door to door doesn't seem that easy.
Well, Christina, thank you so much for the conversation. First of all, I think that we have to level set. The Democratic Party has to modernize how they reach out to Latinos because, quite frankly, Voto Latino, we have been able to pivot during the pandemic. We have actually seen a surge in voter registration. In the month of June alone, we registered over 97,000 folks. 80% of them were under the age of 33, and 75% of them are women. The Democratic Party has to continue having conversations because when we say that the Democrats have not contacted Latino who's backed Biden, we're talking by big stretches. 59% of Latinos who back President Trump have been contacted by the party or by the campaign, compared to 41% of Biden voters who have not been contacted. So quite frankly, when we start looking at where the Latino community is, it is being decimated by COVID. 50% of Latinos either do not have a job or have had their hours reduced. Close to 30% of the Latino community knows someone who has died, sadly, from the COVID epidemic. And we are considered the essential workers, but no one is talking to our policies that really will motivate us. Voto Latino partner with Latino Decisions, and we found three things that are motivating the Latino community right now. One is healthcare. The other is jobs in the economy. And And the last one was racial injustice in supporting Black Lives Matter. 75% of Latinos support the Black Lives Matter movement. They believe that there's racial injustice and inequity in both the Black and Latino community. This is where we have the opportunity for the progressive movement, for the Biden campaign to really discuss it, to unpack it. But I want to pick up on something that Chuck talked about earlier. When we talk about who is eligible to switch this election, it's the Latino vote in unlikely places. It's absolutely in Texas. It's absolutely in Georgia. Because just like in Virginia, while the Latino vote was only 4% of the population, Georgia's 4% of the population is Latino voters. But that created a trajectory of a fast HOV lane into a solidly blue state for Virginia. Georgia has that opportunity as well. Biden needs to do more work reaching out.
Maria Teresa, let's talk about the immigration issue. We remember the times of President Obama, the protest, "Hey Obama, don't deport my mama." He was known in some parts of the Latino community as a deporter-in-chief. Joe Biden is promising a comprehensive immigration reform, as did his boss. How can he convince Latinos that this time it's for real, that this is not an empty promise?
The difference right now is that Joe Biden has promised that they will do this in the first 100 days, and we have the receipts. The Latino community has never been more mobilized around the issue of immigration, but we also have very strong allies. The corporate business community recognizes the need for a comprehensive immigration reform. You speak to the evangelical movement. Even on the right, they also recognize that there needs to be a pathway to citizenship. So this is an opportunity for Joe Biden not only to do right, but he is speaking to the core issue right now that concerns Latinos. Under President Trump, the Latino community has witnessed the highest increase in hate crimes in over 20 years. Every single time Trump goes into and does a rally at a local level, whether we're talking about Tulsa, whether we're talking about Phoenix, whether we're talking about Dallas, the Latino community experiences an increase in hate crimes. Joe Biden would do well to actually have conversations and meet the community where they are. But again, we have the receipts. We have not only his word, but we have a coalition of people to make sure that he and those in Congress will do the right thing.
Thank you, Maria Teresa Kumar from Voto Latino. And now we go back to Chuck. It's a block to watch.
It is, and I don't want to let Maria Teresa go here. I want to ask you this. How you doing? Because I talked to a Democratic strategist and I said, what makes you lose sleep at night right now? And this person said, the disappointing voter registration numbers this year. And part of that has been pandemic induced, and it was across the board. And we've seen, and part of this is, there were a lot of voter registration campaigns that sort of, I think, got knocked back on their socks a little bit because of the pandemic. This was an issue in Look, the Texas Senate race went the way it did because there was not an investment in registering Latino voters on a grand scale that was necessary. You and I talked a lot about that. There were little pilot projects, but they didn't get there. Is it real this time? Are they throwing real money? Because the voter registration numbers are, you have a good month of June, but it's been, hit or miss.
So the numbers have been anemic across the board. I have to share with you, though, full disclosure, Voto Latino, we don't receive any funding from the Democratic infrastructure, even though we shockingly register the most voters in day out. Our funding literally comes from individual donors. And it's because the Democratic Party has yet to come up to speed that the way you reach individuals is online. You just had a conversation on how Twitter and Facebook could potentially disrupt the elections. Well, it's because we are now in our homes. We are having conversations with each other online. And that is what the Trump campaign has figured out long ago. That is not the case what we're seeing sadly in the Democratic camp. And that's the kind of stuff that actually needs to change. When I share with you that we have had our highest voter registration numbers, we have already surpassed our voter registration numbers in history in the mid of July. And that's because we have always doubled down. We are a digital native organization, and that is how we have to talk to our voters. When we know, Chuck, that 15 million of Latinos are ineligible to vote, are registered, but 15 million are eligible voters, but 10 million of them are under the age of 33. When you say speak their language, speak technology, speak to them in digital natives, register them to vote while they're at home.
Maria Teresa Kumar, I have visions of a conversation you and I had over a year ago, and you were talking about, I'm going digital first, I'm doing it all this way, and lo and behold, it turns out it is now the only way. So kudos for having that vision on your part. Christina Landano, an excellent segment, excellent piece there. Thank you. Kristen Walker, as always, Kayla Tausche, and everyone who took part tonight, thank you. All right, folks, 100 days to go. Here's some of what to expect. Mark these on your calendars. 3 weeks from now, the start of the Democratic Convention. We should know who the Democratic running mate is by then. 1 week later, the Republican Convention. And thanks to the pandemic, neither is going to look like any convention we've ever seen before. It'll all be a lot of boxes, if you will. On September 29th, the first scheduled presidential debate. And I say scheduled for a reason. 8 days later is the vice presidential debate. 8 days after that would be the second debate, and followed by the third and final one 1 week from there. And then it's a 12-day sprint to the finish line, Election Day, November 3rd. But keep in mind, it may take weeks of vote counting and political drama before we actually know the winner, not just of the presidency, but the House and Senate as well. And we're going to be following it all for you on all of the networks of NBC. And as the saying goes, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. I'm Chuck Todd. Thanks for joining us.